Hello lovelies, today we're taking a look at Legends of Anglerre, which was the fantasy companion game to Starblazer Adventures for the Fate system, and used a very broadly similar implementation of Fate. So this coming later had a few revisions and so on. That Starblazer implementation of Fate was from an earlier version of Fate than the current one, and also used 2d6 instead of Fate dice, with one die being taken from the other. So if we say that black one's the negative, white one's the positive, that would be 3 minus 4, so minus 1 result. So yeah, it used 2d6 instead of the Fate dice, so you didn't need special novelty dice. One die taken from the other, giving you a graduated level of success, basically from +5 to -5. If you don't know how Fate works, the core of the system is that you have a level of capability in a field, such as a skill, and that generally ranges from 0 to +8, which is a legendary level skill. And most other things are rated on this same sort of scale. So you take your value, you modify it by your roll, +or -5, compare against the difficulty to see if you succeed and by how much you succeed. That degree of success or failure can also be modified by various other character and situational attributes. Like characters have aspects, which are little descriptive phrases about them. Like you could have an aspect that says boundless endurance, and then if something like that happened to come up, you could spend a fate point and you would get a +2. Similarly, there are stunts, which are special capabilities and rules bending things. That can be just about anything, but that covers things that are more like powers and effects. So you might be a peerless swordsman as a stunt, perhaps, and that might give you a +1, maybe a +2. Other capabilities might be more unnatural or rules bending, and for those ones you might have to spend a fate point. And you can also use fate points themselves to adjust the rolls. So that's the basis for the whole thing. I know I've said this before, but there's a lot of new people and repetition isn't necessarily bad, but weirdly, for a game system, Fate, that is meant for freewheeling, heroic and narrative-led play, that base configuration of the system is actually pretty gritty. It strongly favours average results and not the wild swings of success and failure that are normally associated with that style of play, and this has always struck me as peculiar. On the other hand, it does mean that a character who is meant to be good at something is usually reliably good at it, because far and away your results are going to be in the -1, 0 or +1 sort of range. So if you're good at something, you're going to be reliably good at it. If you're bad at something, you're going to be reliably bad at it, and so it goes for the whole game. But it still feels a bit weird that a game like Fate, that is so targeted on that sort of narrative, heroic style of play, has a system that really strongly encourages average results. Yeah, peculiar. So Anglerre, presuming I'm pronouncing it correctly, was a fantasy setting that appeared across many of the fantasy stories in the Starblazer comic book by DC Thompson. These were little sort of digest format comic books printed cheaply in black and white. Usually saw them at the checkout counter in W.H. Smith's when I were a wee lad. And you would have Starblazer, Commando was the other big one that everyone knows. That's the one you probably know them from. The Commandos were collected in a collector's edition not so long ago, blown up to larger size. But these were kind of ubiquitous, if less glamorous than something like 2000 AD or Battle when I were a nipper. So Anglerre appeared in Starblazer as the sort of fantasy setting for most of their fantasy stories. Starblazer sci-fi stories didn't really necessarily exist in the same universe, though some of them did. More of the fantasy stories did, to an extent. There was a certain amount of consistency there. Now, Starblazer Adventures by Cubicle 7, which is the precursor to this and the companion to it, remains one of my favourite implementations of the Fate rules. And while Starblazer Adventures sold like gangbusters when it first came out, it's a shame that neither book really saw the super grand levels of success that they maybe should have had. And it's a shame that both ultimately were tied to the intellectual property of DC Thompson from outside of the gaming sphere. And so, yeah, this is the problem with using other people's IP. Unfortunately, licensing deals run out, and so you have to withdraw the games. So unfortunately, if you do like what you see here and what I describe here, you're not going to be able to get a copy except second-hand, not even a PDF, unless you sell the high seas or are lucky enough to find a second-hand copy of this or Starblazer around. Second-hand copies of Starblazer go for quite a bit of money, at least last time I looked. So yeah, maybe it would be worth it if there was a clone or a refit. And the same would be true of Starblazer as well. I'd love to see the systems that were created here taken forward as a sort of fork of Fate, but the Fate frenzy has somewhat died down, and it has been replaced by the more recent darling Apocalypse World, which I find execrable. So maybe there isn't the will there to genericize Starblazer or Legends. So coming after Starblazer, Anglerre refines a few things, adds a bit of spit and polish, and a few changes. Magic and similar capabilities are expanded on, where it kind of skirted over psychic powers in Starblazer. There are sometimes very different stat blocks for creatures and opponents, and a lot of expanded rules for things like mass battles, castles, cities, and many other doohickeys. Many of which would be useful and are cross-compatible with Starblazer, so you could easily use them for other things, other organisations, other cities, spaceports, whatever else, or equally they're eminently portable to pretty much any other Fate campaign, with things being broadly compatible the same way that OSR material is broadly compatible with other OSR material. Just takes a little bit of work. There's a bunch of stuff you've probably heard me say about Fate games before that I don't necessarily like about them. The integrated group character creation, for example. But you can bypass all of that if you want and just create a character with the aspects and stunts you want rather than going through the process. Yeah, it's all good. And it helps prevent issues if one player that your character is strongly connected to drops out, and so you lose all of that aspect to your character. Anglerre gives you some tables for determining a lot of character details randomly if you want, which certainly takes a load off if you're feeling uninspired. Races and professions are a little bit clumsy, as it is typically in a lot of Fate games. You have to make sure that one of your aspects relates to your race. So you could have arrogant elf, or doughty dwarf, or fat hobbit, or whatever else. And that can be all you need, because then you can use that to justify certain things when you want to tap into that aspect. But it also unlocks certain racial aspects, stunts, or other capabilities. These choices still take up slots that you might otherwise take for something else, but some capabilities might be gate-kept by prerequisites. So, as a human, you might not be able to take dark vision, but if you've taken an aspect as an arrogant elf, then maybe you're able to take dark vision as a stunt or something. So what the race selection amounts to is guidelines more than rules, and suggestions rather than anything hard and fast. The occupations are handled similarly. Typically, Fate isn't something that has classes, so you can create your character pretty much as you want. But as a nod to fantasy archetypes here, you can take an occupation aspect that would then unlock other aspects and stunts similar to the racial stuff, and that would all be stuff appropriate to that occupation or vocation. Armor is tweaked a little from what it was in something like Starblazer. There's less damage reduction, it caps out at -2, but armor can also absorb consequences. So the way health works in Fate is that you have a track of stress, so health stress, and as you get hurt you lose points from that until you're out. But instead of taking points from that, you can reduce or completely negate the damage that you take by taking consequences. So that reduces the stress damage and keeps you alive, but gives you some sort of wound. So armor can now take consequences itself, and the armor is destroyed when all of those consequences are used up. So maybe you could take a consequence of battered chest plate or something like that, and that would reduce the overall damage. But it's not taking it from you, so you're not wounded, it's being done to your equipment. And armor and other equipment can now also have its own aspects, and these can be positive or negative. So like your leather loincloth might give you one level of protection, but has the negative trait sweaty bollocks, or whatever else. Weapons, meanwhile, can do up to +4 damage, and heavy weapons like cannons can do up to +6. Marry that with some of the scaling rules and you're probably onto something. The somewhat expanded skills and stunts serve as examples, but perhaps bulk up the book a bit overly much, make it intimidating and a little hard to leaf through. That's another problem with Starblazer as well, so the same thing there. It might be a bit overly much when there are ways you could do it, like giving examples of different types of stunt and how to create your own stunts, and kind of leaving it at that, apart from a few of the more outlandish ones. That would have been more efficient, I think, and would have played more into the kind of toolkit feel of the whole thing. Powers is where we get into magic, and also where a lot of games go completely off the rails. Here, magic fits fairly well into the whole fate point economy, and is somewhat well reflected in the stunts. You get special ability stunts, such as dark vision, while magic itself is divided into power skills, such as alchemy, the power of death, the power of glamour, and each one comes with certain skill applications, and again unlocks access to special stunts. If you take the alchemy power, for example, that allows you to use that skill to figure out what substances are, to find substances or know where to find them, to create potions that have the effect of your other powers, to purify substances, and also grants you access to stunts that increase the potency of your potions or create universal potions that could be tweaked to have any effect, to create objects out of thin air or to destroy them or to transmute and change them, even to animate objects with some sort of basic life, and so on. And so it goes for each of the powers, and they overlap. So yeah, the potion power under alchemy lets you brew potions, but if you want anything other than those sort of basic sorts of effects, you're going to have to take other powers to create potions that invoke those powers. To be really effective, then, you have to take several powers and stunts from within them, all of which eats up skill and stunt real estate on your character sheet, and the use of fate points as well. So magicians are powerful, but not overbearingly so, and while you can freely create your character to be a combination of different capabilities, being effective at magic takes more effort and more resources. As you'd expect in a fantasy game, creature creation and definitions go pretty deep. Scale, swarms, all sorts of these special exceptions and conditions you need to keep monsters fresh and to give them meaningful descriptions, even within a low sort of stat type game like Fate. It even allows you to video gamify some creatures into having multiple locations that can be hit and one weak spot, and each of those has its own wound track. which is an interesting way of approaching things. The long and the short of it is that Legends of Anglerre is a toolkit game. There's rules for just about everything. Organizations, kingdoms, towns. The thing I would compare it most directly with, weirdly, is the rules cyclopedia for older D&D, because it's a resource with everything you might need to kit bash your own game. The world guide is a bit of an afterthought, but then the fantasy stories in Starblazer were a bit of an afterthought as well. It wasn't the main thrust of the magazine. While the game benefits hugely from the striking black and white artwork from the Starblazer comics, I think it rightly concentrates on being that toolkit and on making Fate into a more nuts and bolts RPG, while retaining much of the heart of Fate, which is ease of use, easiness to grasp and to play with. Now, while this book covers almost everything pretty well, bestiary, all the stuff you need, really. There was a companion book, which was the only other release, which went into certain things in greater depth: city adventures, family generation, expanded lore from the comics content, island adventures, a couple of example adventures, more devices, more magic items, more traps, more vessels, some additional bestiary entries, adventure generation, which is helpful. This would be a good choice for solo play, actually, and a bunch of alternate rules if you wanted to do things slightly differently. And that was all that was ever published for Anglerre. The license vanished in 2014, and nobody picked up the baton and kept going. I forget about this game all the time, and yet it's probably the best fantasy game I've never played. I've used Starblazer's version of Fate for games, and I've used it as the basis for writing games of my own, like Agents of Swing, and I definitely rate both of them as games quite highly. These iterations of Fate are amongst my favourite game systems, but I consistently forget they're there and don't dig them out. I think perhaps it's their relative lack of suitability for campaign games. I think that's a weakness of Fate as a whole. But whenever I'm reminded of their existence, I'm tempted to revisit them and run them, or to create based on the rule system, which I do like a great deal. So when it comes to Anglerre, style-wise, I'd give it a low 4. I like the black and white art, especially the Euro style art from the comic books, but it is very old-fashioned. It was old-fashioned looking even when I was growing up, which is why I bought 2000 AD rather than getting into Starblazer. I much preferred the aesthetic and the level of style and the kind of punk rock coolness that it exuded from 2000 AD, but not from Starblazer. So it's good, but the books themselves show their age in terms of layout and other choices. So a low 4, because it is effective. I do like the comic book art, but layout and everything else, you can tell it's a 15-year-old game book. In terms of substance, everything's there, but it's not massively well laid out. It's not hugely accessible, and it's not a game, it's a toolkit, which is both a strength and a weakness, because while it can be used for anything, it doesn't particularly hang off anything, and it's not until you get the companion that you get a few more details on the world of Anglerre. So setting very much took a back seat. I approve of that, but I do think it's a problem when you sell your book on being Legends of Anglerre and then the setting is an afterthought. So in terms of substance then, it's a low 4 or a high 3. I'm going to say a low 4. So that is, even so, given its age, style 4, substance for overall score, 8 out of 10, 4 out of 5. Yeah, of course, the problem is you can't get it anymore. As I said, you can only get it if you sail the high seas and get it in PDF. If you're lucky, you might be able to print and bind that somewhere. But it is odd that nobody has stepped up and cloned it or stripped it of the intellectual property issues and then put it out again. Because it is such a good rule set, such a good toolkit. The only problem is the character progression, I think. But surely that's fixable. Anyway, it's an older version of Fate, based on old comics, but the rule system is absolutely solid. One of the best implementations of Fate ever. Zang. The world is full of terrible erotica, exacerbated by the existence of the internet and the low barrier to entry. And no, it's not just men describing women in terms of how their boobies jiggle. Now you too can churn out cringeworthy, barely literate erotic nonsense with filthy shades cliché. 2 players, one the dom, one the sub, fill out bingo cards with awful words and props, and then try to fit them into their purple prose over several rounds of foreplay, sex, and aftermath. Whoever scores the most by working their words into their florid gibberish wins. This game was knocked up in an afternoon, but it only cost 50 cents, so bite me. Available at DriveThruRPG and post-mort.com.